My name is William Deresiewicz. I'm a former English professor at Yale, just finished this year.
I'm Mark Edmundson, professor of English at the University of Virginia for the last quarter of a century, and we are here to talk about student evaluation, a scintillating topic for all. Go. Do you want to talk about Anna?
And other topics connected with teaching at universities and how we can make our students better. Mark, I wanted to start by asking you about the piece you wrote in the New York Times Magazine this week. Like all the pieces you've been writing for years about education and teaching, it's something that I think says really great things. And you talk about how we need to, as teachers, we need to resist the temptation to be cool. Because the job of the teacher is, in a sense, to be uncool, to not model the kind of conventional behavior that students are already too invested in emulating, but to sort of be ourselves and give them alternatives to conventional wisdom, conventional lifestyles, and so forth. What I wanted to ask you is that there's another really interesting article in the magazine this week by Mark Oppenheimer about student evaluations and how important they've become in among other things, in hiring and retention decisions for professors, especially non-tenured professors, and the kinds of standards that professors are held to by administrators. And I was wondering if there is some kind of tension between what you were saying, which I agree with, but what Mark is pointing out, which is that if you try to be uncool, it might hurt you in your evaluations, and it might therefore hurt your ability to continue teaching, because your students may not respond the same way.
Yeah, it's a great question.
What do you think about that?
Why don't we kind of lay out the story of Anna Bean? Do you remember it pretty well?
Okay. Yeah, she was the teacher, untenured professor at Wesleyan, who lost her position. Her position wasn't renewed because she didn't meet what sounds to me like a fairly arbitrary standard of student evaluation, which means at Wesleyan apparently you have to get 85% of your evaluations within excellent or good. Now, I'm all for good teaching, of course, but it seems to me that that's not only an arbitrary standard, but it misses potentially the really great teachers, which is the kind of teacher like Anna Bean, who had a sizable percentage of her class saying, this person is terrific, this person really made me think, she's one of the best teachers I've ever had. But then a small percentage who said, you know what, this person really made me angry, I didn't get anything out of her class. So she fell below the 85% threshold, as I recall, not very far below either. That's her story, and it seems to me to illustrate the problem with this kind of method of evaluation.
Yeah. I guess if I were sitting in judgment, as it were, in that case, what I'd be looking for is this. I'd be looking for, the ideal teacher to me is somebody where 30 or 40 or 50% of the students say, hey, this was a life-changing experience. Never had anything like it happen to me before. Then there are another 30 who say it's a very good class. It was well organized. Teacher did her job. And then frequently there are 10% of the students who don't like what was happening at all. And they say, my goodness, I was, keyword here, offended. And then you often have a great teacher on your hands. Now, I don't know what Anna's situation was per se, but if she was getting life-changing comments on one side and then a 10% of it really made me mad, that's kind of an A-plus teacher to me. I haven't heard the other side of the story, but maybe Wesleyan missed the boat on this one. Great school, but maybe.
Right. And I worry that administrators are really sort of moving towards a kind of consumer model. It seems like they want their students to be happy customers. They want, which to me sounds like it would encourage a kind of bland teaching, sort of a bland, predictable teaching. Just like you go into Starbucks anywhere in the world, and you're going to get the same cup of coffee. It's very predictable.
Yeah.
It's never going to be a great cup of coffee, and it's never going to be a bad cup of coffee.
Quick word on behalf of the students, though, and this maybe reflects back on Anna Bean, and maybe it doesn't. And that word is that, in my experience at Virginia, and Virginia's one place, and you've taught at Yale, and that's one place, great place, students are pretty darn tolerant of teaching eccentricities and pushing them in one direction or another. The one thing they don't like, and they aren't tolerant of, is teachers who take themselves too seriously and have no sense of irony whatsoever about what it is they're teaching. They don't need us to laugh at the doctrines of Socrates or Hegel, but they need us to be able to smile at them. And to the degree that we come on with a kind of righteous indignation about our known things about the world that they don't know, and implicitly they're coming from a bad bourgeois, white hegemonistic culture, they're resistant, and I understand that resistance. I'm all for floating those interpretations, but there's got to be a sense of skepticism about them, as I think there's got to be about everything that goes down in a classroom. Any thoughts about that?
Well, it's true. I know that I tend to preach a little bit when I teach too, and I often catch myself out and turn what I'm saying, in a sort of self-ironic direction. I remember I was teaching modern British fiction, and I was talking about how we've moved towards a kind of an idealization of youth, so that we at this point we still live in a culture where we don't want to grow up, or we want to stay adolescent eternally. And I felt like I was preaching, and then I gestured to myself and said, "Look at me, I'm kind of an aging Peter Pan."
Huh.
And my students laughed, and I think that it helped, because you're right. I mean, it's not just that it helped the lesson go down well. I mean, I think the truth is that we're only effective when we're including ourselves, and we're not like Moses coming down from the mountaintop with a set of tablets.
I like that story because it sounds like you let a little bit of the air out of what you were saying, but not all of the air. When I was first teaching, and I think I was maybe a little more interested in getting the big thumbs up in the evaluations, sometimes I feel I'd let too much of the air out, tell too many disparaging stories about Freud or Nietzsche or whoever it was that I was teaching, who I really admired. But it sounds like you handled that with that, kind of 10% ironic deflation that gives people room for skepticism, but doesn't give them an easy dismissal thing. I want to offer a distinction.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, and again, and also that includes you in, that gives students the sense that you're struggling with these issues too. You are not exempt from the things that you're talking about, and you're not exempt from constantly rethinking what you believe, which is exactly what you want to teach them to do, right?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. There's that Lacan is not my favorite thinker, but the concept of his I think most useful is this business of le sujet supposé savoir, the subject who is supposed to know, And I think all of us go around questing for somebody who knows absolutely everything and can tell us the truth about everything, and also go around getting really angry at people who take up that role. It's a really big human ambivalence, and it's something that teachers have to work with all the time. And I guess, what you're saying, and I think it's right, is that Socrates is more our guide in that regard than Plato is.
Nice way of putting it. Yeah, I was very sympathetic to Anna Bean in that article, and there's another teacher who's profiled, who I think was teaching at Ithaca College, who ran into the same kinds of problems. But there was I had a little bit of a reservation. I think they both described students, and they're both teaching politically charged material, the nature of whiteness, or class and race issues in journalism. The Ithaca College teacher was a journalism teacher. And understandably, they're trying to unseat some of their students' assumptions, and it's going to be controversial, and I think that's great. Both of them, though, described a kind of student, sort of the white male jock, backwards baseball cap student who would sort of sit in the back of the room with arms folded, and I can understand that you don't want students who are resistant to you from the beginning, but I was worried that maybe they were the teachers themselves, and I don't know the individual cases, but I've seen it in other cases, that the teachers themselves may have been sort of had a prejudice against those students, a sort of a priori resistance to those students, and didn't give them a chance, just like the students didn't give the teachers a chance.
Yeah, much to be said on both sides of that one, it seems to me. I think, if I remember right, both the teachers were women, yeah? And
yes.
It probably makes it a little tougher there. When I'm not getting along with a guy student and he's sitting there being truculent, on the way out of class, I can say, hey, Sox gave Manny to L.A. and he's hitting 400. What do you think? And there's this kind of guy sense of, oh yeah, okay, I guess we're both guys and we can manage to come to some kind of peace. It's less available to women who still feel, I think, kind of besieged within this within a profession that they've recently entered in numbers. The other thing I want to say on the other side, and it's critical of our profession, I guess, and less more on the side of the students per se, is that some of us may not understand the difference between politicized discourse and intellectual discourse. And I think the thing about intellectual discourse, as we've been saying, is that it's almost inevitably ironic, and it's second-guessing itself, and it's expressing a certain amount of doubt about itself. Political discourse is about being pretty sure of what it is you're saying and not making much fun of yourself. I mean, the days of Jack Kennedy and Winston Churchill in certain modes, where you actually had a leader who was able to be ironic and lead at the same time, seem pretty much over. A person who speaks political has got to step up and tell the unadulterated, self-subverted truth. And you kind of see that dynamic going on in the presidential election, to get to a meatier subject, maybe. But when teachers get political, they often get into that one-dimensionality, kind of that monocultural drone, and students rebel. And who can blame them? They want a soulful human being up there. And so far as those of us who have hung around reading too many books and using too many big words can be conceived of as soulful.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would even refine the distinction you're making between political and intellectual by saying political, but really what I see is ideological, right?
Mm-hmm.
And ideology carries the sense that you know everything you already need to know. You don't need to listen to other people, and all you need to do is transmit what you have already discovered to other people. And it's this kind of transmission mode of education where, like, a student is this bucket that you fill up with facts or fill up with ideas or fill up with attitudes. And I remember, I think, I suspect, I hope that as people, as academics get older, they do this a little bit less. But I remember when I was first teaching as a graduate student, and I was teaching composition, freshman writing. And it's hard enough to do, and I was trying to do my best. But I remember some of my fellow graduate students, one of them I remember, I saw him on his way into class, and he had a thick packet of papers under his arm. And he said, yeah, today is Marxism Day. Like, today in freshman composition is the day that I'm going to be inculcating Marxism in my students.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, the funny thing is... Go ahead, please. A lot of it is that students don't get inculcated very, very much. Are you still there? I think I'm losing you.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still
here?
here?
I'm here.
Okay, sorry. There's this funny disparity between the left-leaning tendencies of a lot of folks, at least in English, and the fact that students come out not, revolutionary Marxists at all. But do you make anything of that? Is there kind of a tension of some kind?
That's a very good point. I mean, what I hear you saying is that this inculcation, if it's happening, and maybe it's not happening. Look, maybe most teachers, especially by the time they become professors and they've kind of calmed down a little bit, are not really going in there proselytizing for a particular ideological position. But it sounds to me like to the extent they are, it's not having much of an effect. And look, is that surprising? I mean, we get our students for a couple of hours a week, maybe 3 hours a week, and they've already been socialized and are constantly being re-socialized to an enormous extent by everything else around them. And the fact is that, to a certain extent, academia is the last bastion of ideologies that have either already been discarded or the preserve of ideologies that have never made it out of academia. So it's not surprising that, one professor is not having much of an effect.
Yeah, I
on
think
their
that,
students.
To go back to one of our old freshman lit concepts, the form and content thing, I think the content of the courses often drops away, but the form of them, which is analytic and knowing and abstracted and doesn't involve self-transformation or self-challenging, that stays around and that goes out into the world and becomes reasonably negotiable professionally and reasonably attractive in a certain way personally. One of the things I tried to say in the piece I did for the Times this week was that in the civilized world, the great enemy of ignorance isn't the great enemy of knowledge isn't ignorance, though ignorance will do in a pinch. The great enemy of knowledge is knowingness, and part of what ideological teaching inculcates is knowingness, which has its satisfactions and rhymes with lots of cultural tendencies out there now, being cool, being analytical, being detached, separating feelings from thoughts. But in human terms, maybe ain't so profitable.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I think we both agree, we've both written about this, that the real goal of teaching should be not filling a bucket, not transmitting either a certain ideological position or even a certain set of analytical skills, but teaching students how to think and how Well, I mean, even the universities say we teach our students how to think, but what they mean is those analytic and rhetorical skills that will serve them very well as lawyers and doctors and people on Wall Street and people in business. What you and I mean by that is to teach people, well, to be morally serious, to think with their whole, let's say to think with their whole beings, not just with the analytic part of their brain, but with their whole mind and their whole heart and, for lack of a better word, their whole soul, about the big questions. What does the good life mean to me? What does it mean to live properly, and how can I do it? And what does the good society look like to me, and how can I help bring it about?
Yeah, I think those are the questions. Those are definitely the questions. I mean, the way I look at it is, secularly religious. I think that a good liberal arts education is an opportunity to be born a second time. I think that our students come to us, and they come from a lot of them, they come from great families, they come from good churches, they come from good schools. And, they've been socialized by those families and churches and schools, and they've been told who they are and what to value and what life is all about. And they've also been told, what their capacities are and what their future is likely to be and what's most profitable for them to do. And I guess the objective of a good liberal arts education is to challenge those things and say, hey, there's some other ways of being in the world, and maybe they fit you better than the ones that you've been socialized to accept. And maybe they don't. Part of good teaching is when somebody says, I came in here a conservative Republican, I'm leaving a conservative Republican, but I thought about it really hard, is to say, beautiful, fabulous. If you thought about it hard to your satisfaction and somewhat to mine, you got an education, and I'm thrilled. But I keep telling my students about what to me is the greatest line in literary criticism, one single greatest line in literary criticism. Take it with you if you want. And it's in Longinus' On the Sublime. And I'll just adapt it a little bit. What Longinus effectively says is that when you're reading or listening to somebody and you feel as though you have created what you've only heard, then you've hit an instance of the sublime. And what I tell students that means is that some part of themselves that has been latent in them has been discovered. And some new knowledge about who they are and what they are has been made available to them. And that new knowledge ought to give them a sense of some kind of different life, either some kind of different public life or some kind of different private life, as you said.
Right.
One of the best ways of talking about this I've heard came from my colleague Dick Rorty, who talks about vocabularies and how we go around using one vocabulary to live, to describe the world around us, but suddenly, based on some great reading or great teaching, we start talking not middle-class Americanese, but Platonic ease, and we start looking for what's good and true and beautiful in terms that aren't nailed down by our particular circumstances, but are eternal and for all time. That's a real conversion. It happens to people, not as much as it should, but it does happen to them, and it tends to be a great thing, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, the way I put it to my students, I've come to say this the first day of every semester in every class. I say, this is a literature class, which means that it's different from all the other classes you take. It's, first of all, it's not about what's out there, although we are going to be examining a certain body of literature, and that's good to know. But it's not about out there. It's not the physicist telling you why the sky is blue or the sociologist telling you why people vote a certain way. It's about you. That's first of all. And second of all, I'm not going to be teaching you anything you don't already know. It's just that you don't know that you know it yet. It's exactly what you just said, Mark.
That's a great way to put it.
You know, but you don't know it yet. It's Socrates' metaphor for the teacher. The teacher is the midwife, right? The teacher is the person who helps draw out what is already inside. And that's a completely different idea about teaching than filling a bucket or training someone who's going to be a good consultant, Wall Street consultant, which is what a lot of kids at Harvard and Yale go on to do.
Yeah.
It's a totally different idea, and it opens a realm of possibility. I mean, really, you're teaching students to discover the possibilities within themselves that they've never discovered before. And it may be the conservative who discovers that he's really a socialist, or the socialist who discovers he's really conservative, or it may be the pre-med who discovers that he really wants to be an anthropologist. Or any number, anything in the universe of human possibility. I think that's what our job is to do.
Yeah, I do too. And, what I love when I give these talks sometimes to students, they say to me in my 56th year, that's impractical and wishful thinking, and you must have come to this conclusion because, you're a rich guy and you could do anything you wanted. Well, in a sense, I was a rich guy in that I came from a working class family, But when I went off to college, my father said to me, well, what would you like to study? And I said, I'd like to study pre-law. I didn't know what the heck pre-law was, and the fact that it didn't exist was no impediment. And he said, well, would you like to be a lawyer? And I said, well, lawyers make good money, don't they? And he looked at me. He had never been to college. He'd only graduated from high school. And he looked at me and said, well, if you don't want to be a lawyer, you shouldn't be one. I said, well, what should I do? He said, well, what are you interested in? And I said, English. He said, well, then you should major in English. And I said, well, that's kind of what rich kids do. And he says, well, you're as good as any rich kid. Go ahead. It added up to the same thing to him. It was the more practical thing to do, to follow my nose, because I figured out what I wanted to do in life, just as a lot of my students do, and I'll bet a lot of yours do too, Bill. And based on figuring out that thing and getting involved with it, the work was relatively easy. The work was not exactly like play all the time, but it was much more doable than doing something like being a lawyer, which was fundamentally against my nature and would have involved bending myself in all kinds of directions that I didn't really need to do. When you were describing
go
ahead, please.
Well, this is what you say at the end of another great piece that you wrote recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education called Dwelling in Possibilities, where you say, your big conclusion is, look, what's really going to make you happy is doing what you love to do. And success, maybe we measure success in terms of wealth and renown and so on and so forth. But look at all the ways we've developed to help people manage the unhappiness that they feel when they're doing those things that are making them a lot of money. Supposedly, 70% of lawyers wish they were doing something else, but they do it anyway. We've got alcohol, we've got a whole range of pharmaceuticals, we've got a whole range of distractions, and God knows what else to help sort of palliate, medicate our sense of unease, when in fact, if we were doing what we wanted, we wouldn't have to do that. Because people who do that are a lot happier.
They're a lot happier. Life is hard anyway. If you're Schopenhauerian, as I at least partially am, one of my favorite lines from Schopenhauer is, he's talking about Christianity, and he doesn't believe in the transcendent God or Yahweh or any of that stuff. But he says, a religion that has as its central emblem a man being tortured on a cross can't be all wrong about everything. So, even under the best of circumstances where you find your thing and do it, there's still plenty of rocks in the road. But you can take one of the major ones out by figuring out what your thing is and doing it. When you were talking about, your courses being about you, I thought of one of Emerson's most outrageous lines, at least to me. And he says, listen, when you're reading, you should think of yourself as the text and all the literature that's ever been written in the world as the commentary upon that text. Isn't that great? Shakespeare is a commentary upon the text who is the student. It's just terrific. It's so outrageous, it's just terrific.
Right. Now, here's the thing, and this partly brings us back to what we started with, which is student evaluations. I'm afraid that the university, as it's currently constituted, doesn't actually, for a whole lot of reasons, doesn't really encourage the kind of teaching that we're talking about. It does not make it easy for teachers to do the kinds of things that we want them to do. First of all, the amount of training that university teachers get as teachers is pretty minimal. These are not people who are, who are getting degrees in education like primary and secondary school teachers. And those certification process, there may be a little bit of training when you're a graduate student, a couple of observations. But the truth is, even when we have graduate students who don't teach very well, it's not like we don't let them continue to teach. It's part of their program. Plus, we need them to teach because we need the bodies in the classroom. So that's one problem. Another problem is that at least at research universities, elite universities, people are hired and promoted and tenured based on their scholarship, not based on their teaching. So there's no premium put on teaching. I don't know what you think about this, whether things are a little bit better at Virginia.
Well, I don't want to be a complete propagandist for my own institution, but we do have some advantages in this regard, much as you may have done at Columbia, based on really kind of, daring and forthright work by people who came before us. The fact that at Columbia there was a guy named Lionel Trilling who wrote things that everybody in the profession perceived as being at least provocative, if not brilliant, and that could be read by the average doctor or lawyer or undergraduate. That's got to have an influence down through time. The fact that I got to teach in a department that had Dick Rorty writing stuff that was very available to the general public on philosophic subjects. that had E.D. Hirsch writing about education, that had Irvin Aaron Price writing for the New York Review of Books, reviewing every good book of poetry, or what he perceived every good book of poetry to come out. That created a precedent in my institution for trying to do work that would be of interest to my colleagues in some measure, but that would be readable by my undergraduate students and would also be readable by, a doctor or a lawyer or somebody who felt he had intellectual or she had intellectual inclinations but had been left out of the conversation. I don't know what things were like at Yale by the time you were there. When I was there, it was a paradise, though of a different sort, not a Trilling, Rorty sort, but of a different sort. But I'd like to hear your impressions, because you just did 10 years at, one of the most formidable and, to me, admirable institutions in the world.
Well, maybe I'll get to Yale in a minute, but let me say, I understand what you're saying, and this tradition that was true at Columbia, Virginia, other places, Columbia where I did my graduate work, of people like Trilling who are addressing a wider audience, and the connection, the unspoken connection that you're making is that people who can speak in writing to a general audience of educated adults have the equipment to speak to students in a general way also. They're not simply specialized scholars who only know a specialized language and can talk about one particular thing. But to be honest, I feel like there's much less room for that in the profession than there used to be. Mm-hmm. I haven't been at Columbia for 10 years, so I don't know the exact nature of the department. I had teachers like that who were more, sort of that general voice, but they were the older people. I had to go to the older people. When I think of people who were role models for me in the profession while I was still in it, Andrew Delbanco, the Americanist, who's at Columbia, Louis Menand, who's now at Harvard, David Bromwich, who is at Yale. These are people who are terrific writers and intellectuals and who can speak to a wide audience. But my observation was that none of these people got their PhD less than 25 years ago. These are all people who are well into their 50s now, I think, at least mid-50s. As are you, I believe.
Yes, I am.
I don't know that the profession is producing a lot of people like this anymore. And I don't think that the profession is very welcoming to people like this anymore. I think it's very, very difficult, passing to the point of impossible, to maintain that kind of double life where you're both a scholar and someone who addresses a general audience.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem. I think, I consider those three people, those writers I admire, and I consider them all in some measure friends. I don't know what. Yes, I do, actually. I'm familiar with the first books of all three of those people, and they were all really good, clearly written, intelligent books that were not unresponsive to the needs of the profession. And once they had gotten those books written and been tenured by them, they went on to do things that were still extremely provocative and interesting to people within the profession, but they began to branch out. And I feel as though I did the same thing, perhaps even more of a theoretical commitment early on. I wrote a book about, Derrida, Foucault, de Man, and all the rest, and not an admiring book about those characters. So I think you may see people doing something like what you yourself, if I'm not being presumptuous, and others may end up doing, is jumping over that first hurdle with an initial book that is responsive both to the system and to one's own dreams, and then developing from there on. Trilling's first book on Arnold is a little on the respectable and academic and cautious side. He's always a little bit on the cautious side. This is so heroic, though. It took him so long to write. He said his wife had that dream about, they went to the president's house, or maybe he had the dream. They went to the president's house, and the president had read the book and said, "Mr. Trilling, we must have you in the English department forever." And I guess that did happen. He went to the president's house and said, "We must have you." And that
doesn't work like that anymore.
No, it doesn't work. It's probably a good thing.
What you say, well, right, that's right. But what you're saying is that you, and I don't mean to denigrate or even in any way glance at the first books that the people you were talking about, including yourself, wrote. But the model you're really laying out, in a sense, is you slip the guard dog, a piece of spiced meat, which is your first book, and then once they let you in the house, you can do what you want. Now, the truth is, I didn't stay in academia, and I wasn't able to stay in academia, and I think my first book simply, I don't want to talk about myself, but I think it simply wasn't responsive enough to the profession at all. It wasn't really going to get me past the guard dog, and that's fine. I think it's even harder now to write that first book that is, I mean, even those first books you're talking about were responsive. Let me stop and say this a different way. I think the way that people are socialized intellectually in the academy now largely precludes the possibility that someone can even get to the point where they finish their first book and they're interested or capable of broadening their address to an educated general audience. The profession is increasingly turning out narrowly specialized, narrowly professionalized minds. And to bring it back to teaching, these are not the best teachers, right? I mean, these are they may be good scholars, but it makes it increasingly difficult for them to communicate with kids who are coming from very, very different places.
Yeah, I fear that you're right, actually. And, when I have graduate students who are responsive to the way I write and who read Menand and Banco and Bromwich and get very excited, we end up having a conversation in my office that takes some predictable turns. It's if I even signal an interest in this kind of writing, which all of those guys did from very early on, if I even signal an interest in this kind of writing, and if I work in your mode, and if you direct my dissertation, do I have any future in this profession? And, sometimes I'm talking to somebody who's 32, 3 years old, who's married, who has a couple of children, has real responsibilities, and it's a tough question to answer, and sometimes I have to express skepticism and worry about it, but eventually I end up saying that, you've got to do the thing that you believe in, and if you believe in this strongly, you've got to do it. Though, at least in the footnotes, you have to be responsive to the system out there as it is. But I think you're right. It's gotten worse, and it's gotten more resistant to the kind of criticism and the kind of teaching that we both value.
Yeah.
Let's talk about students for a while. And also the relationship between students and the institution at large, which I'm more and more thinking about as the academic industrial complex. But you make a distinction in a really nice piece that you wrote recently for the American Scholar between leaders, which universities seem very interested in creating, and to your mind, the opposite of the leader, which is a thinker. Why not just talk about how you came to that idea, which I think is a great one, because the whole leader concept has always made me want to, go out and get a little bit ill, but I wasn't able to fit it into a context of institutional need and institutional program the way that you were able to do in that piece. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Right. Well, first of all, maybe the institutional need, one of them that you're talking about, is that look, universities are businesses. You just talked about the university industrial complex. Even though they're nonprofit organizations, they are increasingly concerned about the financial side of things, and that's increasingly driving things. One of the things it's doing is driving the focus of universities away from the humanities towards the sciences and the lucrative opportunities they provide. But another thing is that they're very careful about tending their alumni base. And as a friend of mine said, somebody who went to Yale College, and his father went to Yale College, and his grandfather went to Yale College, he said to me a long time ago, the purpose of Yale College is to manufacture Yale alumni, right? This is how the system works. This is what keeps the system going. And look, I don't think there's a cynical decision to say, let's not teach our students to be intellectuals because intellectuals don't make any money. But I think that there are large institutional forces that say this situation that we have where something like 10% of our students go into consulting, which to me is an unbelievably large percentage. Right. 10% of the entire class at Harvard and Yale go just into consulting. We're not even talking about investment banking or anything else. Right? There's no incentive for the university to try to do something about that, and every incentive for them to continue to be happy with that situation. Leaders rather than thinkers. What does a leader even mean? I'm not, if you're a great surgeon, does that mean that you're a leader? I don't know. It's the rhetoric they like to use. But I think a neat way of drawing the distinction between leaders and thinkers is their relationship to institutions. The institution of the university, but also whatever institution they end up being a part of. I think of a leader as someone who inserts themselves into an institution, a hierarchy, a bureaucracy, rises to the top, and keeps the system going. And a thinker is someone who learns to be skeptical of these structures right from the beginning, including the university that they're part of. They're not the person who's sitting there at the football game waving the flag. They're the person who's thinking about the context that they're put in and the constraints that that context puts on them, the unconscious messages that that context is giving to them, and stands back and says, do I want to be part of this, and can we do this differently? And I don't think that universities really have a strong interest in having those kind of people around.
It's beautifully put.
What do you think?
No, it's beautifully put. One of the things that's always surprised me about my colleagues, even in the humanities, is that I find that many of them, if not most, are skeptical about everything under the sun except one thing, and that is the process of succeeding and moving along within the profession that they themselves inhabit. Do you know what I mean? That is,
yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to them, and is something that's not dealt with ironically and not questioned much. Tenure and tenure meetings and tenure votes and committees and procedures and all that is perfectly unquestionably fine with them. But, everything else in the world is to be looked at skeptically. Well, I'm with them. I'm looking at the rest of the world skeptically. But looking at the tenure procedure and the institutional procedure of the university itself seems a worthwhile thing to do in many regards too. It gets down again. I love that definition of the leader as somebody who just makes his way up the institutional pole, no matter how greasy it may be. But it gets back a little bit to that measure of irony. And one of the things that these people who are considered leaders can never show is irony, skepticism, sarcasm. They have to at least be able to sound like believers, and say
right.
kind of unequivocal, upbeat things about whatever the hell is going on in front of their noses. And this seems to me to be not only untrue but boring.
Yeah, I agree. Still, we can talk about leaders versus thinkers. We can talk about filling a bucket versus lighting a fire, getting students to, read themselves as texts. I think it still doesn't really solve the problem of how does a university, how does a college encourage students to do this? And I think about things that I've read about the way colleges were in the 19th century. And for one thing, they were still religious institutions to a great extent. You still had students going to chapel every Sunday. Now, I don't know how carefully they paid attention to what the minister was saying, but at least there was an institutional way for them to hear raised these big questions that we were talking about. What is the good life? What is the good society? And there was a flourishing culture of campus literary societies that were actually started by and run by students themselves, where again they debated these issues. And obviously the university's become secularized. We don't want to send students to chapel. I myself, I'm Jewish. I don't, and not particularly a believer. I'm not suggesting that students go to chapel. But the question is, what context are these questions going to be raised? Universities seem to have this dim memory that they should be raising these questions. So students come and they have freshman orientation, and the highlight is when the dean gives a big speech, and he says, you're going to have the best 4 years of your lives, and you should be thinking about the big questions. And then 4 years later, graduation comes, and it's really fun. And the highlight is the president of the university gets up and gives a big speech and says, you should go out and think about these big questions. But in the middle, nothing has been asking them to, so what do we do about that?
Well, I dare say we keep trying to do what we're doing. Write about it, talk about it, try to do it. When it's time to have student evaluation, try to create some alternatives to these standard consumerist, spectatorial type student evaluations. Ask the students to write about themselves and their involvement in the class in a way that criticizes in an upbeat way, not just the teacher and the books, but also themselves. And, just keep making noise. For an institution, a university is a remarkably porous, receptive place, and it also has lots of corners where you can go about your own business in ways that are, if it's reasonably productive, are just surprisingly immune to interference. So it's doable. It's just going to be tough. And when I know that you've just written these two really interesting pieces in the American Scholar, and I've been writing on this subject of education in a book called Why Read and other places for a long time. And you know that what happens when you write one of these things is that not only for the weeks that follow it, but for the years that follow it, your email box is full of letters from people teaching, often at small schools, often who don't have distinguished academic pedigrees, but are really devoted to what they do and saying, hey, you know, that Longinian thing, you put into words what I've been thinking for a long time. Thanks. I've been trying to do this in my class pretty hard, but glad to hear it articulated by somebody who's, you know, got enough time on his hands and, you know, an empty word processor and a place to publish the thing in. And you probably felt the same kind of response. So the folks are out there. They're not teaching at Princeton and Berkeley necessarily, but they're out there and they're listening and they're wanting it. And I think there are a lot of students who are wanting it too. So I don't think the battle's over. I don't think it's going well, but I don't think it's over.
No, I agree with you, and I have had the same experiences, and they're extremely gratifying. I just think it's ironic that we're talking about this sort of guerrilla movement, this very loosely organized, you know, guerrilla movement of people who actually want true teaching at the universities, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy that the thing that you would think would be the essential mission of the university is being forwarded and kept, let's say, even kept alive by this, you know, by a person here and a person there.
Yeah.
You know, and again, it has to do with the institutional context. In a lot of your writing, you know, there'll be so many moments where you say, and then I was talking to the student in my office, and then I was talking to the student one-on-one, and he said this, she said this, and I said that, and they realized, and this is to me the heart of teaching. As much as I loved being in the classroom, especially the seminar when there's give and take, to me the real joy of teaching were those one-on-one moments in office hours, over a cup of coffee, whatever, where students are really talking about what's important to them, and coming to you for advice, and you can kind of draw out, you know, what their real interests are, what their real feelings are. Okay, that's great, but it's time consuming. And if you're trying to get tenure, you've got to publish. And if you've already gotten tenure, and especially if you're, you know, at a Princeton or a Harvard or whatever, you're much more invested in your scholarly career. And probably since you spent the first 15 years in academia not devoting a lot of time to students, or not more than you had to, and I've seen this with a lot of people, then you're just not going to do it. I mean, I know that many of my colleagues were, you know, my students would complain that they were not accessible to them, right? And it was this revelation to them that I would welcome them to my office hours. In fact, when I taught a seminar, every time I taught a seminar, I would insist that they come to see me at least once. And this was this huge revelation to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if universities are not making it, you know, easy for teachers to do this, it's going to be very hard to do it. And you do it at the peril of your future, quite frankly.
Yeah, I feel for you in that regard. It's a tough thing. It is. It just is.
I didn't mean to bring us all the way down.
No, that's okay. But when you know, when I give talks to colleagues in the field, and they say, "Well, can you just compress what you have to say into a sentence?" Which I always love trying to do. And I say, "Well, I think what we should do is experiment with considering ourselves as teachers first and writers and scholars second. And that teaching should be at the heart of what we do, and that by and large our writing should be guided by the concerns of teaching. That is, we should be trying to get people who haven't read the books we've read excited about them, and we should be providing insights into those books that are available to our colleagues for the purposes of disseminating those books, making them available to other people, to our students and to the general public. Yet the tremendous measure of energy goes into writing books that are often intellectually brilliant, contain a tremendous amount of hard work, learning, research, knowledge, and are written with the greatest integrity, but that are, by and large, unread, and frequently border on the unreadable. And, you know, that when I think of the tremendous social and humanistic energy that's locked up right now, at least my branch of the humanities, amazing people with just fabulous talent, astonishing verbal ability, wide learning, and it's being locked down in narrow professionalization. It's kind of a tragedy. I mean, you know, it's not Darfur or anything, but it's a little sad.
It is. You know, basically we're still working with the 19th century German research university model, right, where what a professor does is produce new knowledge. But that was a model that was developed when there were relatively few universities. before the explosion of the college-age population after the war. And it's simply obsolete. I mean, the fact is that most of the work that's being done, probably in any field, really does not need to be done. I think there's a terrible sort of cynicism and kind of corrosion of the soul that sets in. You know that you've got to churn something out, even if you aren't invested in it.
Yeah.
All this kind of thing. You and I are now talking about trying to move, at least to a large extent, if not to every extent, trying to move to, let's say, a liberal arts college model, where teaching is first, and you need to write, but maybe you don't necessarily need to write original scholarship. Let's say there would be just as much credit towards professional advancement given to writing for a general audience or doing different kinds of writing. So that's what we want to see, from a research university to a liberal arts college, let's say. Unfortunately, the direction that we're going in is from a research university to a vocational school. And I'm afraid that the model of the future is not Swarthmore College, but something like the University of Phoenix, which is that for-profit distance learning place that's really selling education as a vocational commodity.
Mm-hmm.
And, I fear that without our having realized it, even the humanities at elite institutions have moved towards essentially a kind of unconscious vocational training, right? Like you said, your colleagues are teaching Foucault and Derrida very, very difficult material and think that they're getting students to think in a radically new way. And in fact, what they're doing is teaching students to analyze very difficult material and develop those analytic skills, but they're going to forget about Foucault and Derrida, and they're going to keep the skills and use it to analyze the balance sheet of a corporation that their consulting firm has a contract with right now, right? So what we're selling is these very highly sophisticated analytic skills, which is another way of saying we're becoming a vocational school.
A lot in it, I'm afraid. A lot in it. I think that what the responsibility that we got is to try to persuade people, but particularly students and their parents, that the best thing you can get out of a liberal arts education isn't the analytical skills, but some measure of self-knowledge that helps you figure out what's really going to make you happy, and it's going to make the people around you not unhappy, and maybe happy too, in the world at large. And that's going to be very, very difficult to do. Please.
Let me cut in on you for a second, because I'd like you to talk more specifically. You just mentioned students, parents and students, but especially students. In that piece you had in the Chronicle, Dwelling in Possibilities, you have what you lay out in this wonderful way, your, I think, wonderfully insightful way, and also a way that shows how engaged you are with your students, how much you're listening to them and asking them about their lives, sort of your sense of where this generation, this cohort of students is at. And I wonder if you could expand on that.
Sure, I'll try. I mean, I guess it seemed to me that when I was teaching in 1997, that if you wanted to understand students, you should understand their major mode of technology, which was television. And that what television was about was spectatorship from the condescending position of the couch with the magic wand that lets you flick from place to place and be flattered by the material that was in front of you. So it made you feel like you were kind of king of the world. And that created a certain kind of student who was pretty tough to teach. 10 years later, still kind of a McLuhan determinist, at least about young people's culture. And it seems like the most influential form of technology now on my students is the computer. Not anything unexpected. And what that's created is a generation of students who are really smart and quick-witted and very restless and very impatient and like to skate over surfaces as quickly as possible. The drug of choice is likely to be Concerta and Adderall or a quadruple latte. And the hangout of choice is likely to be Starbucks, and the computer's on all the time, moving from website to website, page to page, in ways that are really, to them, exciting, and exciting to me, too. It's a kind of romanticism, it's Byronic romanticism. And the best phrase for it that I know of is Nietzsche's, who says, a romantic is somebody who always wishes to be elsewhere. My students always wish to be elsewhere. One of my favorite images of students, I said, well, what's a party like now? I always feel like an anthropologist sometimes. What's a party like now? I said, are people on the cell phones all the time? Yes, they are. And who are they talking to? they're talking to other people at other parties that might be better than the one that they're at. So everybody who's at a party is talking to somebody else who's at a party, so that nobody's ever present where they are. Being present is like, a thing that just doesn't happen. I mean, the Dalai Lama would weep. He's the Buddhist paragon of presence in all things. And the sort of favorite line I got off in that piece was saying that, hey, by the drugs you'll know them, and this time it's coffee and it's analogs, and that just about half the Starbucks that surround various universities now are probably in places where 20 years ago there were head shops, and marijuana and LSD were the drugs of the day, and what the drug stores are going to be 20 years from now will be the big question. It'll tell you a lot about the students who are out there doing their thing. Now, you were very close to Yale students who kind of concentrate the very best and the very most daunting of students. What were you perceiving when you were there?
Well, here's the thing. First of all, I'm not sure that I talk to my students a lot. I think you have a level of awareness and insight that surpasses mine. You said in your piece that you imagine that at Harvard and Yale this trend, is sort of goes, is so far that students kind of eventually bond with their computers and simply enter cyberspace as a kind of neuromancer character.
Yeah.
I didn't actually see that. It may be happening. I didn't see that. And for instance, you talk about students bringing laptops to class. I never saw that. It may be happening in other lectures. I certainly would have immediately made them put it away, but I never even actually saw that. What I saw, and this was sort of the fascinating take-home message for me about student lifestyle, is how incredibly involved students are in undergrad in extracurricular activities, to the extent that they far overwhelm their investment in their classes. These are kids who are doing 6 or 8 different things at once. Because I tended to see, obviously I saw mostly English and humanities majors, that meant that they were either student journalists on some kind of publication or 2 publications or 3 publications, or they were involved in theater. They all were either journalists or they were sort of actors, directors, whatever. But then, of course, there's also various forms of social action in the community, sports teams. I mean, singing groups, right? The a cappella groups are famous at Yale. The point is, this is the center of their life. These extracurricular activities are the center of their life.
Interesting.
And it occurred to me that, ultimately maybe what they're doing, without realizing that they're doing this, is creating a kind of parallel syllabus, or let's say even a parallel university, self-organized, spontaneous, responding to what students really want to do, and maybe ultimately even more valuable for them as they go forward into the workforce than what we're teaching them.
Yeah,
they're giving themselves the education they really need.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that.
That's amazing. No, I think back, and a little reminiscence, we have an hour. My time at Yale was between 79 and 85, and I was, breathtakingly lucky to be taught by people like Harold Bloom and Jeffrey Hartman and John Hollander, and indirectly, but influentially, by Leslie Brisman. And these were people who were both analytically oriented and visionary, poetic, speculative, and very idiosyncratic in their take on things, and they all continue to be in their way. But my experience of Yale then was that, in a certain sense, at least as I, as a kind of first year and somewhat disoriented graduate student, perceived it, people like this were setting the tone for a large part of the university, and that it was their place and our place, and that the desire for intensities that were intellectually satisfying, imaginatively satisfying, very demanding, but also rich and eccentric, was something that was percolating not only through a lot of the graduate students, but also into the undergraduate student body, who were getting in touch with a sort of scholarship that is, epitomized in other ways by very eccentric people like, Leslie Fiedler and Norman Brown and Herbert Marcuse. Bloom and Hartman are much different from them. But just that sense of being both very imaginative and also widely read and learned was something that I was feeling all around me, and it was incredibly wonderful and exciting. And as a feeling that the undergraduate culture was looking to that sort of thing for inspiration. And what you're describing is an undergraduate culture that has gone its own way, and that would never think of trying to base itself upon what I saw as a really powerful and attractive faculty culture that, kind of, when I was writing, books about kind of, Freud and the Romantic poets and literary and cultural theory early on, those were books written with great excitement, and not the sense that I was jumping through a hoop, but that these people had made available to me a mode of scholarship that was also intensely and richly imaginative, and I was thrilled by it, and I thought that, and it was sort of percolating all through, even to the extent of being written up in a not unsympathetic way in the New York Times Magazine. Right. So the world has changed.
That is a remarkable picture. That is really a remarkable picture. Exactly what you just said. I mean, never mind even the specific modes of thought that these professors, that these luminaries were promulgating. Just the idea that undergraduate intellectual culture would take its lead from what the professors are doing, inconceivable. I mean, I would hear students talk about the star lecturers, Jonathan Spence, the China scholar, Vincent Scully, the great teacher of generations of artists and architects. But, and they love to go 600 kids in an undergraduate population of 5,000, 600 kids would show up for Vincent Scully's lectures in any given semester. But there was no sense that these people were more than, celebrity teachers. It was not about giving the lead to campus intellectual life. And it reminds me of something, I think it was in the Times Magazine at some point in the last several years, where I don't remember who the author is, but he talked about how college used to be this separate place that students would go to, this separate world that students would go to for 4 years. That it's some piece. Right?
Yeah.
Was discontinuous with what they came from and what they were going to. And now those discontinuities have been bridged, and it's just another, right? I mean, they come in with the same things and they leave with the same things.
Well, this is a new thing that I'm working on, is this notion that I got called the monoculture. And the idea of the monoculture is that there is very little oppositional culture in America. It's really kind of in line with this guy said last year in the Times, that I sometimes look out at my undergraduate students and what I want to say is, dudes, how about some alienation? How about some opposition? How about some counterculture? How about telling me that, like, it's not just that I'm wrong about this or about that, but that I'm using the wrong words and, got the wrong vocabulary and, need a new pair of glasses or something. I just, there used to be a sign. It was over the English department at the University of Virginia for 2 or 3 years when I was first there, and showed suggestive of the general conference of the place, I suppose. It was just written in crayon that said, "Everything you know is wrong." I sort of want my students to rise up and say, "Everything you know is wrong." Excellent, let's rock.
I know.
But as it is, it's a culture that is in many ways continuous. It's a unified sort of culture, and not in a great way. But when I was there, there's a sense of, Bloom and Hollander as seers, and not that you would say what they said. Nobody believed, per se, went around sort of believing in the anxiety of influence, but that you would approach literature and try to make some large and vaunting and really exciting point about it, was something that, the undergraduate poets felt, I felt, and the undergraduate English majors felt, and the graduate students were kind of, responding to and getting skeptical about, or getting excited about. It was hugely exciting. You're suggesting to me that this lives now only in my imagination and may never have lived here. I think it did live in fact, but it did exist in my imagination. I'll take it.
Sorry?
I'll tell you, it was another phase of just amazing good luck.
No, I think that not only it was the way you say it was, but I think that the same was true maybe in other ways or to a somewhat lesser extent at other places. I mean, I remember something like the same kind of thing at Columbia when I was in college there in the early 80s. This sense, of this shared intellectual culture and looking to professors for intellectual inspiration. It sounds to me like, once again, our thoughts are running along very similar lines, because in developing my ideas about what I think the problems are with elite education now, I've been thinking about what you just called the monoculture.
Yeah.
That, as Trilling would say, there's no no to the yes in our culture. In fact, I want to write a book. I don't know what I would say, but I want to write a book that's just going to be called No. I have no idea what the content is going to be yet, but I just want to call it No.
Would you use the Groucho epigraph, whatever it is, I'm against it?
Yeah, right. But, in thinking about this, it occurred to me that what was that alternative that people sort of had their sights on as a beacon on the horizon for so long. And I identified two things that I think have dropped out of our culture.
Yeah.
And the first thing is socialism, quite frankly.
Yeah.
It's not that, I mean, there were Marxists, there were Maoists, there were Trotskyites on campus, but I think there was a more general kind of soft socialism that subsisted from the middle of the 19th century until maybe the fall of communism or around that time, where you didn't have to be a Marxist, you didn't have to be a communist, you didn't have to be doctrinaire, but you just had a sense that there needed to be an alternative to capitalism and that you were for it. And it may have been very soft-headed and woolly-headed, but it was out there as a kind of ideal.
Yeah.
And that's gone. And the second thing that's gone is sort of modernist aestheticism, right? This sort of the cult of, this idea of the artist as hero, where everybody wanted to be James Joyce. Lots of students want to write novels now, but I think now they want to be Michael Chabon. They want to be really great novelists who are really successful, but not this kind of Joyce or Proust or D.H. Lawrence, this sort of burning soul that throws the whole weight of his being, on the scales against society and wants to sort of create a new world through art. So socialism is gone as an alternative possibility. Aestheticism is gone as an alternative possibility. What are the alternatives to the way things run now?
Well, you've hit it. It's opposition is gone. The people who want to write novels now, you're quite right. They want to make it. They want to be Jonathan Franzen. It happens to be a pretty darn good book. By chance, and it did in fact make it. He seems to, it is in some measure an oppositional book that put the corrections, and also a really rich, rewarding, and kind of warm one. I think that the absence of that socialist ideal, or I'd even say, because it's been so badly tainted in many ways, by some other ideal, some willingness to do a lot of speculating about the alternative to current, corporate capitalism. It's just, that speculation is not there. There are a lot of people who hate corporate capitalism, and they hang around universities, and they hang around, automats and laundromats and cafeterias. Good for them. But an alternative idea is hard to seek at this point, and I would think that there'd be lots of economists and political scientists out there trying to make their name by becoming the next, LaSalle or Marx or whoever you want to put as the founder of socialism, rather than just analyzing what's out there on the table now as though it's the only thing that could ever happen. So those are the two sources, and also the absence of that socialist ideal for secular people means that the main standard in life is radically and aggressively individualistic, and the sense of being part of a collective and having the warmth of a group and having people who you're looking out for and they're looking out for you is gone for lots of people in universities, and it's made it very chilly there. There's no way around that.
Yeah, it seems like the cause that students are excited about, sort of the rallying point, and quite rightly, is global climate change. Mm-hmm. They're absolutely right to be very, to make that the center of their concern, and I'm glad they're doing it, and obviously it's something that desperately needs to be addressed. But it is ultimately a technical question, right? Not too many people anyway that I hear are talking about how do we need to radically change our economic system in order to address global warming. It's about how do we adjust it. We're still going to have corporate capitalism, but we're going to have wind power instead of burning oil, right? Yeah. So these are important questions, but they're technical questions. They're not ideological questions. They're not intellectual questions.
Yeah, and there are human needs too. Yeah. There's the need to distinguish yourself and make a name for yourself and succeed in life. But there's also this strong, abiding human need to come together in large groups and to treat each other well and to consider others with love and to be loved by others in a large-scale way. And our students who are not religious don't have a lot of access to that. And even some of them who are religious are so eccentrically and nonconformistically religious, at least in my discussions with them, that I don't think they get the warmth of the collective at all. So it's a tough time. It's definitely a tough time to be a kid, but there are these, there's still these great books, and they're hanging around waiting for you anytime. And as Phil,
I agree. I think we're over our hour, but I think that's a good place.
Yeah, that's maybe end with Julian's line about how those books, in the beginning, he didn't understand them and was bored by them, but later he found out that they knew him better than he knew himself. and that they've become great friends since then. And there they are waiting for anybody who's got some time.
Right, right. Okay.
I'm going to get out of here the right way this time. Thank you. We'll be in touch again, okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah.